Good afternoon. Welcome to our 8th FIBERcast webinar, brought to you by the Department of Fashion Apparel Studies and the College of Arts and Science at the University of Delaware. FIBERcast is made possible through the funding of the U.S. Department of Education Business and International Education Program. My name is Shen Lu, and I will moderate today's webinar. Please be noted that all attendants will be assigned the listen-only mode. If you have any questions, please type in a Q&A box located at the lower right of your screen. As many of us know, the Rana Plaza building collapse, which occurred in Bangladesh in 2013 and resulted in a death toll of 1,129, is the worst single garment factory accident in history. What shall we learn from this tragedy? What progress has been made in the past 2 years? What can be done further to improve the corporate social responsibility practices in the Bangladesh garment industry? Joining us today, we have 5 distinguished panelists to discuss these critical questions and share their first-hand observation of what is going on in Bangladesh. First of all, I'd like to invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting from Zara Hayes. Zara.
Hi everyone, my name is Zara Hayes and I'm a documentary filmmaker from the UK, and I got involved in this when we were commissioned by the BBC to make a film about the Rana Plaza tragedy for the BBC.
Okay, how about Sarah Hamilton?
Hi, my name's Sarah Hamilton and I'm the producer of the film. And like Zara, I got involved when the BBC commissioned us to make this film. We made it over a year and a half ago now, in the run-up to the first anniversary of the tragedy.
Okay, next we have Mara Burr.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mara Burr. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Albright Stonebridge Group. I work with the Alliance for Bangladesh Workers' Safety, working with brands and retailers in the United States, Canada, and Australia to ensure the safety and security of the garment factories in Bangladesh. I've worked on Bangladesh issues now for several years. Previously, I was with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, working on South and Central Asia.
Compliance, certification, and education organization. We work all over the world, have offices in different parts of the world, including in Bangladesh, where I spend a good deal of my time. I happen to be on the board of advisors of the Alliance, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. Looking forward to what I'm sure will be a great discussion.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have Dr. Marsha Dickson. Marsha.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Irma, Ayers Professor of Human Services at the University of Delaware. I'm also co-director of UD's Sustainable Apparel Initiative, and I've been researching and teaching about corporate social responsibility and issues in global supply chains for over 20 years. I've actually never been to Bangladesh, but I will be there soon, and I'm starting some research there. I'm also on the board of directors of the Fair Labor Association, which is an organization that is working to improve working conditions in factories around the world, and also a board member of the Fair Factories Clearinghouse, which is an organization that facilitates communications about audit data between companies. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today. So first of all, let's talk about the Rana Plaza. As we all know, in 2014, Zara and Sarah produced a documentary about this tragedy. So Zara and Sarah, can you two briefly tell us about your documentary? For example, what is this documentary actually about? Why do you make it? And what do you want the audience to take away from watching the documentary?
Absolutely. So it was about a year after the Rana Plaza incident that the BBC came to us and decided that they wanted to make something for the anniversary, for the 1-year anniversary. As it was such a huge story, such a huge news story, although they covered it quite extensively in the news, they felt that there was space for another film about the tragedy, and something that perhaps went into more depth or told the story in a slightly different way. given that it's the biggest industrial accident in the fashion industry and the second largest industrial accident in the history of the world, they felt that they had to do something to commemorate it that was more than news coverage. And so Sarah and I are documentary filmmakers first and foremost, and they came to us to bring that documentary approach to the subject. So we started to think about it and research into the issues more. Neither of us are from a fashion background. Neither of us have done anything about this industry before. And you can very easily become overwhelmed by the scale of the tragedy itself and also by the complexity of the issues that it sort of speaks to and brings in. And we felt that we needed to hone in on a simple, powerful message for the film. And so throughout our research, the one thing that struck us at the heart of the story are people and the garment workers and the people who have been involved directly in the tragedy. And so we thought, what would it be like if we gave them a platform to speak for themselves and to tell the story in their own words? So that was really our focus for the film. And, it's quite a simple premise in a way, but hopefully a very powerful one. And through telling their stories, we hope that the film would tell the story of the Rana Plaza tragedy in detail, but also hint at the bigger issues and explore some of the wider issues within the fashion industry, the history and importance of the garment business in Bangladesh, and the changes in the fashion industry in terms of fast fashion and some of the sort of systemic changes that have occurred in the fashion industry in recent years. And to show that the Rana Plaza was not an isolated incident, although it's the worst. It's the worst in a string of incidents that have happened in Bangladesh and other countries that supply garments to the global fashion industry. So that was really, how we approached the film, and everything that we thought to do was to prioritize the testimony of the workers, really.
Marsha, I know you've also watched the documentary. As experts on corporate social responsibility issues, how do you like the documentary, and what does the film impress you most?
This is Marsha. Yes, the documentary was very powerful, and I really applaud Zara and Sarah for their work. I think importantly it tells a story from those who survived from the point of view of the workers, and it provides insight into the true horror of Rana Plaza. I think it's a sobering documentary, and one that it's very important for people to remember what happened, and also to better understand the effort currently underway to ensure that it never happens again. And I know that's very hard to do, perhaps impossible, but I think if you continue to remember the horror of Rana, it keeps the fire alive, and it helps also to make you get up in the morning and know that what you're doing is important. So I really applaud the film. I thought it was very well done.
Thank you. Marsha?
Sure. I think I made a couple observations after watching the film a few times. So I watched it again last night. And I think, first and foremost, it does a great job of putting a human face on workers in the apparel industry. Not only, for consumers who might watch this, but for students like ours here at the University of Delaware who are going into, jobs like in the apparel industry like design and buying and product development. It helps us remember that there are actually people making our clothes. And I think, that's obvious, but it's not always top of mind. I know that often some of the more junior employees in the big apparel brands and retailers who make day-to-day decisions that impact workers have never been in a factory and don't really think about them on a daily basis. So I think it's really helpful in humanizing the industry and really highlighting that people die making our clothes. And, it's not an isolated issue, and I think we have to question why that happens. Do we value cheap clothing so much we're willing to put another person's life at risk? And the one other thing I wanted to comment on, and not so much an impression that leaves me with a little bit more concern, I think, is sometimes when we have a very powerful situation like this in a very tragic situation, there's a tendency to start thinking that a whole country's industry is alike, that every company in that industry is alike. And certainly the inspections that are being done by the Accredited Alliance show for a lot of work that needs to be done to upgrade factories. But I think nonetheless every country has, that at least that I've visited, has variability in the factories. Some are very well managed, some are very modern facilities, and some are poorly managed and poor facilities. And I think we always need to remember that each factory might be a bit different, and try not to think about a country as one type of situation.
Okay, thank you. Avedis, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I'm glad you put it that way, because all I have to do is just add a couple of things. Mara and Marsha have said a lot of good things, and the advantage of going last on this one is I don't have to repeat some of those things. Although I will repeat one point, which is to express my own admiration for the documentary, and to take this chance to thank Sarah and Zara for giving us this documentary. It really was extremely well made. I will also echo one other thing that impressed me most about this movie, which is that it was as even-handed a production as I've seen when it comes to handling this tragedy. Too much of the coverage, as sort of Marsha alluded to, tended to essentially demonize the industry as a whole, and certainly Bangladesh as a country. And of course, we are not trying to minimize the tragedy of what occurred, but it is important that it be seen in context, and I think Zara and Sarah did as good a job of that as any, by recognizing the importance of this industry, the good it has brought to Bangladesh, and making the point, perhaps implicitly, or at least one of the things I took away from it, is one of the reasons why it is so important to make sure this doesn't happen again anywhere, certainly, but especially in Bangladesh, is because this industry is such a lifeline, such an economic growth engine for the country. And for them to tell the story the way they did, putting, as Zara mentioned, people at the heart of it, was very well done. It was powerful without being preachy. It made its point without vilifying the industry or the country as a whole, but nonetheless, emerging from it, a viewer is left with that strong desire to ensure it happens again, and that it's work that all of us on panel are getting.
Yeah, I totally agree. So Zara and Sarah, one thing I personally feel very impressed about your documentary is your interview with those survivors from the Rana Plaza tragedy. So what was it like going to Bangladesh and talking to these people? Can you share with us some behind-the-scenes stories?
Hi, this is Sarah. Both Zara and I have done a lot of filming, internationally in different parts of the world, but it was actually the first time that either of us had been to Bangladesh. We worked closely with local NGOs to introduce us to people who had survived the Rana Plaza tragedy, and we first spent time talking to people without the camera and explaining to them what filming would involve, and giving them a chance to think about whether they wanted to take part or not. One of the main challenges for us was sort of language, really, as neither of us are Bengali speakers. So we worked very closely with 2 Bangladeshi production assistants that we had, and a team of translators. And one of the things.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. And one of the things we wanted to do was to produce interviews that felt intimate, and like the interviews were talking directly to the people watching the film. And so to achieve that, we set up quite a complex technical system of simultaneous translation, where the people were answering the questions that Zara was putting to them, and at the same time they were being translated by another person in another room and fed back to Zara on an earpiece. So it could be a continuous conversation. rather than a stopping and starting. And I think, or I hope, that sort of added to a sense of intimacy in the way in which the interviews came across. So I don't know if you want to talk about the sort of, how you thought about what you wanted the documentary to look like, and how we did that with the interviews.
Yeah, hi everyone. Zara. We thought it was very important that this looked beautiful, and somehow felt distinct from the kind of film or video coverage that we might have seen about the tragedy, and also particularly in relation to talking to garment workers. I thought it was really important to be able to take them to a space where we took them out of their context and we just listened to the person. We gave them the space and the sort of silence in a way to really listen to their testimony. And so that's where the idea of taking them to a kind of studio space came in. Mm-hmm. And then we thought about, well, how do you, what backdrop do you have? Because, if you're taking someone out of context, quite often in documentaries you'll just get a plain background or a kind of, photo kind of drop background. And we thought, actually, what's something that is, in context but also feels calm and allows you to really concentrate on the person. And it's sort of, we experimented a lot of things, and then we hit upon the idea of actually using pieces of cloth and material in the backdrop of people's interviews that were in some way a continuation of what people were wearing, and the colours sort of matched. And that was the sort of starting point for thinking that we could create a kind of composition for each person that felt like distinct but part of the same film. Distinct but part of the way we film is music. Most of the film would be in Bengali, and the audience wouldn't be Bengali again. So we knew it was subtitles, so it was very important that you start a direct engagement with the people. And so we used this technique in Carriage, which pioneered by a filmmaker called Irma, basically allowed the contributors to speak directly into the lens. So it looks like they're speaking to the audience directly and engaging with eye contact. And I think that really added to the immediacy and the connection that at the heart of what we wanted to do. We wanted to get to know these people and feel that you can relate to them. And so that's really our approach, and we listen and we try to give a dignity to the testimony.
Okay. So now I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think the documentary on Rana Plaza tragedy bring out those aspects of the garment industry that many people don't know?
I think, this is Sarah here, as we sort of touched upon already, we wanted to sort of put people at the heart of the film and to sort of just highlight, as Marsha said, that people are making our clothes. And while that's obvious, I think there is a disconnect there sometimes. And so that was one of the things that we really wanted to come out in the film. So that was, one of the most important things for us.
Okay. Mara, do you have any comment?
Yes, I would like to just make a couple of audience to consider. There were a number of structural, legal and regulatory barriers on the part of the government of Bangladesh, the factory owners, the building inspectors. I think it's just very important to understand that this tragedy could have happened in many different industries. And so I think there's been a shorthand to say, or to vilify the textiles and apparel, the garment industry. And that is oversimplifying what happened, in my opinion. I also think the issue is very complex. And what was striking about the documentary was just the number of players involved, the focus on the owners' activities across the board in Bangladesh, and I think just understanding that there's a role for many stakeholders to play, and I think in a large respect, the lessons of Bangladesh demonstrate that all stakeholders need to be empowered and be able to play their proper role and to inquire and to push forward to ensure safety across the board. And so I think, we need to be mindful that this was a very complex issue, and there were shortcomings on many fronts, and I think that the film does bring that out.
Avedis, do you have anything to add?
Sure, Sheng. I think Mara is correct in observing that the complexity of this issue should not be ignored, and the film does do a great job bringing that out. But I think the real beauty of it, and the point I guess that Sarah and Zara were making, is that they, while trying to adequately represent that complexity, which they did do, they did also want to simplify in terms not of ignoring the complexity, but of the heart of the issue itself, and again, people being at the heart of it. And I think this has been achieved unquestionably. And I can tell you, I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh, and the last 8 years, 5 or 6 times a year, I go there, and I've had the opportunity to speak to survivors of this tragedy personally. I've been to the site, at a time when, let's just say, it still smelled of what it was, and all the complexity that we rightly recognize today, and all of the complexity that we are trying to grapple with in the work that is being done by RAP, by other organizations like RAP, by the Alliance and the Accord. We're trying to make the best we can of a very complex situation, but let's not, in the thick of things, forget about the simple aspect that it's about people, and that's what's at the heart of this. Having said that, the people in question are also not just the workers. That's one of the things that I liked about this documentary. It recognized the need to hear from other players in this, and Vidya, I think, did a very good job representing industry, and obviously the story of Desh Garments is a fascinating one, even without the backdrop of the tragedy itself. The message to take from this, and I think Mara sort of mentioned this in a different setting a while ago, is to paint Bangladesh with one brush as a whole country, as a whole, as the industry as a whole, is not only unfair, it is next to impossible. I have seen some incredibly good factories in Bangladesh, world-class facilities, just as I have seen incredibly bad factories right here in the US or in any other corner of the world. The fact that Rana Plaza garners all the attention that it does is understandable. It should never be forgotten. It should never be repeated. But it should also not be taken as representative of either Bangladesh as a country or the garment industry as an economic entity. And that, I think, is one of the things that, as I said earlier on, that I admire about this film. It is trying to make the message without being preachy, without being overly simplifying and just picking on a villain, be it the country or the industry.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your comments. Marsha, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the audience who is going to have a first question of where do we get our hands on this film, and I'm sure the producer and director will tell you. But I think one other thing, I agree with everything that's been said. This is such a complex issue, and one other thing I think the film brings attention to, though maybe less extensively and more implicitly, is the pressures that brands and retailers' business activities put on factories and subsequently on workers. And that pressure comes in many forms, from the low prices offered to factories and always wanting more embellishment, better quality for less money. The constant changes in styles and the volume of orders that are placed on factories as brands and retailers try to meet the real-time demand of consumers. And I think, that is worth exploring a lot more because in some cases, the factory is trying to do a good job, but they're put under so much pressure that it's very, very hard to do a good job and nearly impossible to comply to any code of conduct.
Right. Thank you so much.
And Shang, actually, not only is Marsha absolutely correct, but I also want to add one other thing that was very nice about the documentary is it recognizes that pressure starts not from the brands, but from the consumers. That whole segment at the beginning that showcases all those folks, doing their little video logs about the stuff they've bought recently, and one of them even acknowledging that perhaps she didn't need to buy as much as she did. I think that's a very important little point that is part of the larger mix here, that we can talk about how unsustainable some of the manufacturing practices are, how unsustainable some of the brand and buyer pressures are on the factories, but also perhaps we need to discuss how unsustainable some of our consumption habits have become.
Exactly. Well, actually, we will have one question about consumer later. Well, now let's move on to the changes after the Rana Plaza, because we all care about, whether garment workers in Bangladesh or somewhere in the world are still risking their lives making clothing for us. So still first, I'd like to ask Zara and Sarah, from your observation while filming the documentary, and what changes are happening in the Bangladesh garment industry after Rana Plaza? And what people in Bangladesh actually are doing to prevent tragedies like the Rana Plaza from happening again.
Sarah again.
Zara and Sarah?
It's Sarah. It's a bit confusing because our names are very similar. We made the film in the run-up to the first anniversary, so it's over a year and a half ago since we were in Bangladesh. So I think there are probably people on the panel that can give better insight to a certain extent on this. One thing that obviously changed after Rana Plaza was that the minimum wage in Bangladesh did get lifted. It got raised. It's still, campaigners still very much say it falls short of a living wage. So that's something where there's still quite a lot of work to be done, I think. Other people can talk about the Accord and the Alliance initiatives that obviously have been a big part of the changes that have been happening in Bangladesh since the tragedy. I think we've tried to keep abreast of what the changes are happening ourselves just by following the news reports, and I think some of the things that jump out is that there's still a lot of work still on workers' rights. I know there's a Human Rights Watch report that came out on the second anniversary about the challenges there that still very much exist. And I think, one of the things that has happened since the tragedies, there has been, a lot of attention drawn to the garment industry, which is a really good thing. And one initiative we've become aware of is Fashion Revolution, which is a global campaign to sort of bring about change within the industry to make sure that something like Rana Plaza never ever happens again. So there are glimmers of positive things really happening there. But in terms of the on the ground, probably some of the other panelists can answer better than us.
Thank you. Zara, do you have anything to add to Sarah's comment?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that we included the story of Apparel, which is the worker-owned co-op, at the end, just to sort of give a sense that people are starting to think about new ways of doing business in Bangladesh. And at the time, we believe that was the first such initiative in Bangladesh, but it felt like it felt a glimmer of hope to us, and something that we thought was very important to put in there, because what struck us about Apparel, the factory, was that they very much wanted it to work in terms of being a business. They didn't want charitable donations. They wanted it to sort of hold its own as a business, as a factory that could make money, and then the profits would be split between the workers and the owners. And that just seemed quite exciting to us. And I'm really sort of heartened to hear you all say that you felt the film was even-handed in terms of showing the importance of this industry to Bangladesh, because that's one of the things that struck us most when we started looking at it. It would be all too easy to make a sort of film that was almost anti-business in relation to this issue. And in fact, what was really important to us to show was how fundamental this industry is, and how you know, particularly for the lives of women, it's been a huge step for Bangladesh, and to sort of take that away, or to have a sort of anti-Made in Bangladesh campaign, would be a very reductive thing to come out of this tragedy. So yeah, I think, you know, there is definitely something attitudinal there about how Bangladesh sees itself growing and developing in terms of the kind of businesses that it wants to have, that I think it was in its sort of early stages when we were there, and I hope has continued. We spoke to a couple of factory owners who were talking about moving up the sort of the value chain in terms of starting to introduce design elements into Bangladesh. At the moment, you know, Bangladesh produces the staples, sort of mass produces the sort of the staples that can be ordered months in advance, the skinny jeans and the sort of t-shirts, the basics. And I know that there was a conversation going on about how to move Bangladesh up that sort of the value chain, so that it can add value to the products that.
Thank you. Zara, do you have anything to add to Sarah's comment?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that the you know, we included the story of Apparel, which is the worker-owned co-op, at the end, just to sort of, you know, give a sense that people are starting to think about new ways of doing business in Bangladesh. And, you know, at the time, we believe that was the first such initiative in Bangladesh, but it felt like it felt a glimmer of hope to us, and something that we thought was very important to put in there, because what struck us about Apparel, the factory, was that they very much wanted it to work on, in terms of being a business. They didn't want charitable donations. They wanted it to sort of hold its own as a business, as a factory that could, you know, make money, and then the profits would be split between the workers and the owners. And that just seemed quite exciting to us. And I'm really sort of heartened to hear you all say that you felt the film was even-handed in terms of showing the importance of this industry to Bangladesh, because that's one of the things that struck us most when we started looking at it. It would be all too easy to make a sort of film that was almost anti-business in relation to this issue. And in fact, what was really important to us to show was how fundamental this industry is, and how you know, particularly for the lives of women, it's been a huge step for Bangladesh. And to sort of take that away, or to have a sort of anti-Made in Bangladesh campaign, would be a very reductive thing to come out of this tragedy. So yeah, I think, you know, there is definitely something attitudinal there about how Bangladesh sees itself growing and developing in terms of the kind of businesses that it wants to have, that I think it was in its sort of early stages when we were there, and I hope has continued. We spoke to a couple of factory owners who were talking about moving up the sort of the value chain in terms of starting to introduce design elements into Bangladesh. At the moment, you know, Bangladesh produces the staples, sort of mass produces the sort of the staples that can be ordered months in advance, the skinny jeans and the sort of t-shirts, the basics. And I know that there was a conversation going on about how to move Bangladesh up that sort of the value chain, so that it can add value to the products it produces. And I think these things will take a really long time, but the fact that they were being talked about when we were there is kind of very exciting.
Okay, thank you very much, Zara. Now it's turn to Mara. And we know the Alliance for Bangladesh Workers' Safety is a major effort from the U.S. business community in response to the Rana Plaza tragedy. And I know that you are serving as their senior advisor. So can you give us some updates on what the Alliance has been doing, what major accomplishments has been achieved, and any future work plan of the organization? Mara.
Yes, thank you very much. The Alliance for Bangladesh Workers' Safety is comprised of 27 companies, global brands, in the United States, Canada, Australia. I think it's important to note that the Alliance was able to inspect all the factories from which our members source, have worked with factory owners to develop corrective action plans. Those corrective action plans are made public, and we are working with the factory owners. We have a great team in Dhaka. We work with some really accomplished professionals. Ian Spalding of Elevate runs the Bangladesh operation with a really great dedicated team. And they've done incredible work to send inspectors out to factories, engineers, to focus on building electrical and fire safety issues. It became clear early on that in addition to the structural, electrical, and fire safety, it was important that workers should be trained in fire safety issues, so that a training program was launched with approximately 1.2 million workers trained in fire safety issues. And so we all know that fires will occur in garment factories. There are just too many ingredients to start a fire that there have been a couple of fires. There have not been deaths in respect to the fires. And those factories weren't necessarily Alliance factories. Some of the factories are those that source Accord brands, some are shared factories, and some are factories that are not registered with BGMEA. Those are the ones that fall outside of what the Alliance and the Accord are doing, but nevertheless you have a large waterfront of factories in Bangladesh, and so those that are outside of the Alliance and the Accord, the government of Bangladesh and the ILO is ultimately responsible for doing those inspections. But for the Alliance-focused factories, we've undertaken this training program as well. In addition, the Alliance set up a helpline for workers to be able to call in to cite safety issues, and that worked very well. In particular, I'd note that when the Nepal earthquake hit, we received many calls about safety issues, where we were able to send out professionals and engineers to check the safety of the buildings. And I think, importantly, when we're talking about remediation efforts, it became clear that the factories also needed to meet the remediation financing requirements, bringing in fire doors, excuse me, in some cases sprinklers, and in some cases addressing issues related to fire safety or electrical issues. So the Alliance worked with the International Finance Corporation and the Accord to set up a financing facility of $50 million. That was announced earlier this year, and recently it was announced that the Alliance is working with the U.S. Agency for International Development to provide another financing facility to smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So the Alliance is working to inspect, remediate, train workers, and also to provide financing for factory owners so that they are able to afford remediation. These are just some of the things the Alliance is doing. We're also working to the extent we can to coordinate with the Accord, to coordinate with the government of Bangladesh, to coordinate with the International Labor Organization, and to reach out to stakeholders in the United States, in Europe, and other places to ensure that, to the extent we can, we're all working together. This is a huge issue. It's a huge undertaking, and one that really requires all of us to work together and to find ways to to collaborate, creative ways to collaborate to address what is a huge challenge, I think, on the part of all of us, recognizing too that the government of Bangladesh lacks capacity in many areas, and for this effort to truly be sustainable, the government of Bangladesh will have to build an enormous amount of capacity to be able to oversee and regulate the safety.
Hello?
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 Okay. All right. Yeah, sorry. It was cut for a little while. Sorry. Just a short announcement. We'll move on to the live Q&A session very soon. So for all the attendants, if you have any questions, please type in the Q&A box located at the lower right of your screen. And now I would like to ask Avedis. So we know the worldwide responsible accredited production is the world's largest independent social compliance certification program. So based on your work, do you see corporate social responsibility practices in the Bangladesh garment industry actually has critically improved after the Rana Plaza? Why or why not? And how do you compare CSR, that is corporate social responsibility, in Bangladesh, compare with some other leading apparel manufacturers in the world, such as China, Vietnam, India, Cambodia, and Indonesia? Is Bangladesh still significantly lagging behind? What's your view?
Well, those are all very good and very important questions, Cheng. Ultimately, what I always say with regards to Rana Plaza is that if there is a silver lining to be seen around the very dark cloud that was this tragedy, it is the increased attention it has brought to the issue of corporate social responsibility, of social compliance and responsible manufacturing. So I think the answer to the sort of umbrella question, has there been some critical improvement in CSR practices in Bangladesh after the tragedy, is yes, there certainly has. And Mara has done a great job talking about how the Alliance has contributed to that, and the Accord has done some similar good work. Other organizations have done their part in it as well. I think if there is to be sort of one generic point that can be made here, it is that this issue has now arisen to the highest level of attention. It's no longer something that the garment industry or the owners or individual factory managers or proprietors have been able to sort of give any short shrift to. It's no longer something that is also to be considered. It is front and center and very much a part of their daily thinking. And that's kind of the why of the improvement. The why not side of it, I think the challenge remains in Bangladesh, certainly, but really it's not a Bangladesh specific challenge. That social compliance remains something that the owners and factory managers, while now recognizing as being of the highest priority, still see as something of a necessary evil. It is considered, yes, we have to deal with it, but frankly, we'd rather not have to. It's something we do because of necessity, not something we do out of recognition of the actual benefits that come from it. I think that culture change is still in the process of happening and hasn't quite seen the tipping point arrived at. And as I said, it's not just a Bangladesh issue. It is an issue broadly speaking. Those of us who practice this, whether it's the work that RAP does or the FLA, I'm sure Marsha can speak to this as well, recognize very strongly that there is a great business as well, from treating your workers the right way, from having a socially responsible approach to manufacturing. But the truth is that factory owners still think of this as a cost rather than as an investment. And I think that has to be the sort of next arena of change. In some ways, evolved our thinking, my thinking at least, as trying to position RAP, position social compliance practitioners as attitude change agents, trying to get people to see the importance of this and move their thinking from, oh, this is, think of it this, it's similar in some ways. It's a crude analogy, but it's similar in some ways to when seatbelts first started to become mandatory here in the United States. The complaints back then were legion, and people ended up doing it at first just because they had to. They didn't want to get ticketed. Now we recognize the value of it, the safety of it. It's no longer something that crosses our mind as an extra step, as a necessary evil. It is very much part and parcel of the way we drive. It is something seen as a positive and not as an imposed negative. I think that change has to happen. As for your last question, how does Bangladesh compare with other manufacturing destinations? It's a very difficult one, and perhaps not a very fair question. As I said earlier, I think trying to characterize the whole country, with one adjective is not possible. There are good factories in Bangladesh, many of them. I have seen world-class manufacturing units that will really stand their ground against anywhere in the world. So I mean, as far as good examples go, there's plenty of those as well. Just like there are plenty in the other countries you mentioned, in China, in Vietnam, or India. But I do believe that the larger point is probably a fair one to make. The level of awareness of the importance of this issue as a result of Rana Plaza is probably higher in Bangladesh than pretty much anywhere else that you mentioned. And that, I hope, will translate into good action and, more importantly, good attitude adjustment as we continue the work that we do there and as we continue to see the evolution of the industry in Bangladesh. So if it is lagging behind now, I think it's only as a perception because of the attention the tragedy has garnered. Rightfully so, but it does not mean that there is no recognition of the importance of this issue in Bangladesh, and certainly no lack of action on the part of Bangladeshis of all stripes, the garment industry, the workers themselves, civil society, other programs in the country to help drive corporate social responsibility, to drive social compliance and responsible manufacturing in Bangladesh.
No, that's a very good point. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I would like to ask Marsha. So how does the academia look at Rana Plaza? Does the tragedy lead to some new research questions? And what's your recipe for improving corporate social responsibility practices in the Bangladesh garment industry? Marsha.
Thanks, Shin. Well, I don't know that I have a specific recipe, but I do carry a soapbox for those people who know me. And I want to comment back to what Avedis was talking about a little bit, about the business benefits of good compliance. And, I think it comes down again to the purchasing practices of brands and retailers, to consistently choose the best partners you could do business with, and then to reward them for being your best partners. And I think, that's still not always done. I know companies will have key suppliers and a lot of business goes through them, and they are probably some of the best suppliers there are out there. But, to be thinking about the quality of the management, the way management thinks about and values workers, and the willingness to own the problems, those ought to be top priorities when it comes to the suppliers we choose. And there ought to be a system to incentivize and reward that. And I think that's where there is a drop as well, where the reward is getting to keep business rather than perhaps getting a larger share of business or getting a longer term look at business with the company, or even what the suppliers would probably say, higher prices for better quality work in every way that you go. In terms of academic, I think there's always a lag in academic research. It takes a bit of time for academics to collect data, to formulate a project, to collect data, and to get it out into the publication arena. But, I have seen some things come out recently that appear to be reflecting a broader range of scholarly interests in the types of issues that we see here. I just browsed around an academic database yesterday and saw articles related to, risk management, risk in real estate development, post-operative or post-traumatic stress disorders in workers after a tragedy like this. And I think those reflect, at least from my view, a little bit broader range of academic scholarship around issues associated with global supply chains. There's been a research from the labor rights, labor activist point of view. There's been research from a business and CSR point of view, but this is the first time I've really seen that breadth. Maybe it's just me being more observant to it. I think the other thing is, as an academic, I see a lot of research publications reflecting the ideas of the researcher. They're referred to as conceptual pieces. They're ideas, they're propositions about what the great fix is. And there tends to be a lot more of those than there are studies that collect empirical data and really get into the nitty-gritty and the complexities. And I'm a big advocate, proponent of field research, that to really be able to tackle these issues and contribute to the solving the tough problems, the researcher really has to get out from behind the computer and get in the field and really understand the complexity of what's going on.
All right, thank you so much thanks so much, Marsha, for the updates. All right, now we can move on to the live Q&A session. So once again, all attendants, if you'd like to submit any questions to our panelists, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. So here we already have some questions here. First one is, will enhanced factory inspection increase production cost and make apparel made in Bangladesh lose price competitiveness? We know it's a very fierce competition. The market is really very competitive. Any panelists want to respond and answer this question?
I think it is a concern. Sure. There are real costs associated with upgrading the facilities and upgrading working conditions. That's why I'm so appreciative of the work the Alliance is doing on helping with the finance, so that it doesn't all come to the manufacturer to come up with the funding for, what might be very costly repairs. So that would be
Thank you, Marsha. Any other panelists? Yeah, please.
This is Zara. I mean, one of the things that comes across in one of the interviewees in the end of the film video talks about the fact that if companies want factories to meet compliance standards, that they do need to pay more per item. And just picking up on one of the things that Avedis said that struck me was that seeing it as an investment, not a cost, and that goes for the brands and the retailers as well as the factory owners, that to invest in the suppliers that you're working with and build long-term relationships and have a meaningful dialogue with the workforce is an investment for the long term. And so that question about whether the price point is the only factor in choosing who your suppliers is one that I think is a good question for the industry to sort of ask.
Sure. Thank you very much.
This is Mara. I just wanted to add one point to that, and I think I just want to ensure that as we have these discussions, we don't forget the role of the government, because this is not just a private sector issue. It is obviously the focus is on the textiles and apparel industry, but when you're talking about investments and ensuring the sustainability of an industry, you also have to look at the role of the government and its commitment to an industry. And I think in particular in the case of Bangladesh, let's remember, this represents about 80% of their exports. It's a huge driver of the economy. And we just have to remember that the government of Bangladesh has a large role to play. And to date, they have not played the role they should, and they need to invest and they need to build capacity as well. So as we're doing this, as academics, as filmmakers, as policy folks, let's remember that there's a role for many stakeholders, and I think when we say, oh, if only this group would do X, let's remember it's not quite that simple, and there's a larger number of stakeholders that have to step up and invest and commit to a safe and secure industry.
Exactly. I totally agree. Excellent comment. Okay, we have a couple of questions asking about the consumer side. So to prevent tragedies like Rana Plaza from happening again, what each individual consumer can do or should do? Any panelists want to respond to this question?
Well, this is Mara again. I actually, yes, from my work, I actually do check the labels of where my clothes are made before I buy them. I'm not sure many consumers do, nor am I totally convinced in the many discussions I've had over the last few years of how many American consumers know where Bangladesh actually is versus Pakistan, Honduras, Nicaragua. So to some extent, there really is a need for consumers to educate themselves and to understand what it is they're buying. And if they are truly committed, then they need to do something. There was a shocking interview after Rana Plaza when, and it may have been CBS, it may have been another outlet, went around and asked consumers if they would pay more to ensure tragedies like that wouldn't happen. And I think the overwhelming response was no. And so, consumers in some respects have taken up the challenge, and in some respects have not. So, I think there's a huge learning curve for consumers to just understand what the questions are that they should be asking.
Hi, this is Zara. Just to add to that, I would absolutely agree. One thing that struck me was another sort of survey that was done around kind of fast fashion and consumer awareness of production was something where people were coming out of a high street store and they were asked about a t-shirt that had kind of beading on it, and they were asked how they thought that was made, and people just assumed that it was some sort of automated process that they were stuck on, or there was a machine that did it, and they were no one really understood that it was the sort of human being who stitched each of those beads onto this particular t-shirt. And I remember thinking that's very powerful, because clearly people just so fundamentally don't understand this process. There's a lot of education to do of the consumer.
Okay, thank you. Because of time, probably this is the last question. It's about subcontracting. So subcontracting, as some of the audience ask, is regarded as an indispensable part of today's global apparel supply chain. But factories undertaking subcontracting work operate in a black box, and many of them are off the chart for inspection and audit. So any progress or new thinking on how to solve the subcontracting issue in the garment industry?
I'll start off with this
Any
one.
panelists? Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We do a lot of
I can hear you clearly.
Factories at RAP, and it is indeed a challenge, like you said. We get to inspect the factory that is applying for certification, but if they use a subcontractor, it does not necessarily give us insight into working conditions at that subcontractor. And that can be a real problem, because almost all these tragedies that we have witnessed have, when you dig down, taken place at subcontractors to those making for the larger brands who did inspect the main factories but did not have visibility into the subcontractor. So there's a couple of things that we're seeing happening in the industry with regards to this issue. One is an increasing clampdown on the part of the brands and retailers with regards to the terms and conditions for doing business with a factory that either expressly prohibit subcontracting, and they enforce that through penalties and other means that make it economically punitive for a factory to engage in those kind of practices, or, and this latter approach I think is probably the better long-term, requiring that facilities just be transparent about who they subcontract with, and have those facilities in turn be inspected or at least subjected to some kind of review, because the truth of the matter is, I don't think that as a practical matter, subcontracting can be eradicated simply. So saying don't subcontract, I don't know how sustainable a sourcing policy that is. Rather, be transparent about it. Let us know who you're subcontracting with. For RAP, just to give you an example of the way we do things, when we certify a factory, our requirement is that they let us know if they're subcontracting. We cannot force them to in turn force the subcontracting facilities to be inspected, but we do require the factory that we are inspecting and certifying to at the very least proactively convey to their subcontractors the expectation that they are in turn to be abiding by local laws and RAP principles. And then that hopefully will lead to a cascading, which at some point will result in those factories in turn stepping into the light, so to speak, coming out to seek certification. So really, as far as new thinking goes, I think the transparency approach ultimately is going to be the one that will likely be the most productive and yield positive results.
Excellent point. Marsha, do you want to add a brief comment?
No, I don't think so.
Subcontracting?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
Just to say, this is Zara.
Okay, sure. All right. Yes.
This is
Yes,
just
please go on, Sarah.
Sarah, to say that it does seem in the research that we did that subcontracting is a huge issue in all this, and I think Avedis was right to talk about transparency really, and transparency across the supply chain is has to be the future really, so that consumers know exactly who's made their clothes and all that people have direct relationships across the supply chain of the people who are producing clothes for their brands.
Thank you all. Because of time, our webinar has to stop here. But our efforts and care for the corporate social responsibility practices in the garment industry definitely will continue. And we look forward to seeing more progress to be made in Bangladesh, and we are all stakeholders. So once again, thank all panelists for joining us today, and thank you for all attendants listening to our webinar. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to contact us. That concludes our webinar today. Have a very nice day.